Sending and receiving alerts from IT devices is extremely important. Whether something has gone wrong or capacity limit has been reached, you'll want to know so that you can take action. But if you have a lab or a home network, setting up an internal email server isn't always practical, and that's where an SMTP gateway like Mailrise can help. You still send emails to it, but it converts and forwards these onto messaging services like Discord, Pushover, Slack, and so on. And this can be very useful because you won't have to store public credentials on all of your devices that need to send alerts. But how do you set up Mailrise in Docker and configure it to send alerts to Slack, for instance? Well, if that's something that you're interested in finding out, then stick around and watch this video, as that's what we'll be going over. Now, because this video is specifically about setting up Mailrise, I'm going to assume you already have Docker installed, or you know how to set it up. If not, then I do have another video which shows you how to install that in a Debian VM running on Proxmox VE, so you can get the best out of both technologies. Now, there are different ways that you can install Mailrise, but we're going to be using Docker, specifically Docker Compose. So what I need to do is to edit the YAML file for that. So that's docker-compose.yml. Now, I've already got this running Prometheus and Grafana, but if I was starting from scratch, I would have to put in a version number here, plus our actual services section. But because this is an existing setup, all I need to do is just copy in the actual details of the container that I'm going to be setting up for this. So I'm just going to copy and paste in the details here. So to reference this, we're going to be calling this Mailrise, and then we're pointing it over to the actual image, and we want the latest version. To make things a bit easier to see, we're going to give it a container name of Mailrise, and we're going to stick with the default ports, which is 8025, so that's TCP port 8025. Now, this is something that I want running 24/7 basically, but rather than setting the restart to always, I'm actually going to set this to unless stopped. The reason being is I might need to do maintenance, for instance, in which case I don't want this to automatically restart the actual container if I actually stop it. So that's why I've got it set to unless stopped. Now we do have to actually configure Mailrise specifically to tell it about the actual service or services we want it to forward alerts over to. In which case we've got a volume setting here where we're going to map the actual container file itself, so that's /etc/mailrise.conf. to an external file we'll set up in a Mailrise folder called mailrise.conf. So that allows the actual configuration to survive a restart, for example, but also we need to be able to configure it in the first place. So I'm going to save the contents of that file. And now we've actually got Mailrise set up as a container. Now, Mailrise is an SMTP gateway. So the idea is you send emails to it, and it then converts them over to whatever actual service it is that you want to use. And it does actually support quite a lot of them. It refers to Apprise notifications. And if you follow that link, it takes you over to the actual GitHub page for Apprise itself, and it shows you a lot of actual services that you can actually send notifications to. But for this video, what we're going to be doing is to use Slack. That's an instant messaging service which you can actually use for free. And it gives you some details about the setup. But if you click on that, it'll give you a lot more details than what you're just seeing here. But the first thing we need to do is to, well, create an actual account for Slack. So if you go over to slack.com, it'll take you to whatever web server is suitable for you. And to create a new account, we're going to click on Try for Free. Now, this is a passwordless service. The idea is you'll create an account, and what it'll do is when you fill in your actual email address, it'll send you over an actual confirmation code to that email address. But every time you log in, you always get a confirmation code. So you never store a password anyway. It's always a one-time way of logging in. So I need to put in my details to create a new account, and then click on Continue. And then what it does, it actually asks for an actual confirmation code. So once I receive that confirmation code, I'll fill those details in here. So I entered the confirmation code that I received, and now we're on an actual dashboard here. What I need to do is click on this option to create a workspace. and off it goes, and it's waiting to connect, taking a bit of time. So it's actually asking for the name of your company or your team, for example, and this will be the name of your Slack workspace. So I'm just going to call this one Home Lab, for example, but you can call it whatever you like. And then click Next. Once details of your name, you can put in whatever you like for there. I'm just going to click on Next. You want to know if there's anybody else going to be on the team. Well, in this case, I'm just setting it up for actual alerts and so on. So I'm going to click the option here to skip this step, but then I've got to click skip the step just to confirm that. And it wants to know what you're actually working on at the moment. I'm just going to say Home Lab. Well, this is going to be the actual channel name, so I'm just going to call this actual alerts, because that's what I want. It's going to create an actual channel for me. That's where I actually want my messages to be going to. So we'll call it alerts, then click on Next. And then it's just going to go through a bit of details here, but I'm just going to click away. So that's it. We've now got an account on Slack. Now we need a way for Mailrise to actually communicate with Slack. And you'll probably find quite a lot of videos out there using what are known as webhooks, but they're actually being deprecated on Slack, in which case we need to set up an app for this. So to do that, if you navigate over to api.slack.com/apps, in my case, well, this is a new account, so I don't have anything already created, so I'm just going to click on Create an App. I'll then click From Scratch. Then I need to give it a name, so I'm just going to call this Mailrise. And then I need to tell it which actual workspace that this is going to go in. So I'll click on the one that we created earlier called Home Lab. And then just click on Create App. Off it goes. And that's it. That's our app created. Now the next thing we need to do is to create a bot. So we're going to scroll down here where it says bots and select that option. And then what we're going to do once this dashboard loads up is click on the option Review Scopes to Add. And then scroll until we get to Bot Token Scopes. The reason for this is that we need an actual OAuth token, as it's referring to be able to allow Mailrise to actually communicate with Slack. And what we need to do as part of this is set up the actual permissions. So we're going to click on Add an OAuth Scope and scroll until we get to chat:_write. Select that, and that sets up the permissions. Then if we go back up to the top, we're then going to click on Install App in this left-hand pane here. We now need to actually install the app into the workspace. So we'll click Install to Workspace. And it's just basically asking for confirmation. Do you want to allow this? So I'm going to click on Allow. And then what it gives us is an actual token that we can now actually use for Mailrise. So what you want to do is take a copy of this. You certainly don't want anybody to be able to see this, so do keep it secret, but you can always get back to it later if you go to OAuth and permissions down here. But for now, what we can do is we can copy that, put it into a text pad, for example, so that we can just use this in Mailrise itself to allow Mailrise to actually communicate with Slack. Now the next thing to do for Slack is to add our bot to the channel. So I'm on the actual desktop version of Slack and I'm in the alerts channel. So down here what I'm going to do is I'm going to type in the @ sign, and then what I can then do is actually select the actual app. So I'm going to select that, hit return, and it says, do you actually want to add this person? So I'm going to click on Add the Channel. And that's it. We've now got ourselves plus our actual bot in this channel. Well, now that we've got Slack set up, the next thing to do is to actually configure Mailrise to use it. So because we're using Docker, and I like to keep things separate, I'm creating a completely new folder for Mailrise called Mailrise. And then we're going to edit the configuration file that we referenced in the Docker Compose file. So that's for me, mailrise/mailrise.conf. Then I need to paste in the configuration details for Mailrise to use. So up the top we've got configs, and then you start to define the actual services. So in our case, this is going to be for Slack. We need to give it details of URLs, So for this particular setup for Slack, we've got Slack, then a colon, // then the name of the actual app or bot, then @ and then the actual token that we got from Slack. Then we've got a / followed by a hash, and then the channel that we want to actually post our alerts into. In this case, it's called alert. So you've got to have that hash before you actually tell it what the actual channel is. But we'll save the details for that. And then what I'm going to do is to actually start this up. Now, to save time, I've already got that image downloaded, so this should go pretty quickly. But it's set to run in the background. So there it is, we've now got that up and running. So I'm just going to run a quick check. And it's saying that Mailrise has been up for 5 seconds basically. We're listening on port 8025, so it should now be good to go. Now the next thing to do is to actually test that Mailrise is working. In other words, if I send it an email, do I then get an actual alert on Slack? Now, how you actually test that really depends on your actual circumstances. I'm running Docker here and thus Mailrise on a Linux computer. Now, I don't want to install any additional software, so what I'm going to do is to use Telnet. So because it's the actual same computer, what we're going to do is to telnet to localhost, in other words itself, and then port 8025. So it's not the standard port 25 for an SMTP server, it's port 8025. Then I'll hit return. Now, bear in mind there's basically no security on this computer. There's no login credentials, there's no TLS certificate being used for encryption of the actual information being sent, so do bear that in mind. You can always change these afterwards if you're particularly concerned, but the key thing is anybody who's got access to port 8025 on this computer has access to Mailrise and can then send email alerts off. But in our case, as you can see, we've just logged straight in. So the first thing I need to do is just send a hello message, and I need to tell it what the actual domain is. One thing I've noticed is that some of these systems can be a bit fussy. Normally I would be using homelab.land, for example, but I noticed that if you're going to use this on a Windows computer, for example, you can run a PowerShell command. It doesn't like that. It's very fussy when it comes to the actual fully qualified domain name, so that's why I'm using homelab.local here as an example. But either way, once I've done that, I'll hit return, and we're getting a message back of 250, which is good. I then need to tell it where the email is coming from. So it's coming, in my case, admin@homelab.local, for example. To be honest, it doesn't really matter what you actually use for that. We're just interested in alerts. Mailrise and ultimately whatever service you're using doesn't really care about where the actual email address is that you're sending emails from. But what is important is where you're sending your emails to. So we've got receipt to, and then what we've then got is the actual name of the service, which in this case is Slack, and then it's @ and then the domain is mailrise.xyz. Now, you can actually change that. You can actually set that up within a config to use something else, but that is the default domain that it's going to be listening for. So we'll hit return, and we've got a 250 OK for that. Then we need to send it some data. So I put in data and hit return, and it's saying basically just put in your data and then use a dot or period there to finish. So I'll tell it who the actual message is coming from, admin@homelab.local again. I'm then going to give it a subject, and I'm just going to call this Linux test. Then we'll put in our actual message itself. So I'm just going to say test message, and put in a dot, hit return. Then I've got a 250 OK, and then what I'm going to do is just quit, and that's it. So that's sent the actual message over to Mailrise. So if we go over to Slack, there you go, there's our test message. Now the beauty of this setup to me is that there isn't much to configure, and it should be easy to back up and restore. If you want to see the technical details of this setup though, you can find those on my blog, which I'll link in the description. But once Mailrise is up and running, you can now point most applications and devices to this SMTP gateway to receive alerts. Better still, to be able to receive these on an app, which should be easier to find than if you're sending them to a general email account. Now, there are lots of alternative service to Slack that you can use, but for me at least it's free and it comes with a 90-day history limit, and since alerts are meant to be acted on as soon as possible anyway, that's not really a problem. Just bear in mind though that internally there is no security or encryption for the emails being sent to Mailrise, so it might be something that you want to consider setting up. Now if you find this video to be useful, then do consider subscribing to the channel, as that would really mean a lot to me. But it's also a good indicator to let me know how videos like this are helpful to people such as yourselves that are watching. In which case, thank you. On the other hand, if you're not ready for that level of commitment, then I'd really appreciate it if you could press the like button, because that way that'll help to get the video out to other people that might find it useful as well.